When the Tet Offensive was over, the National Liberation Front was nearly wiped out, leaving the Americans in control of the cities and most of the hamlets of South Vietnam. For their effort, the Communists had lost a total of 45,000 dead, while the Americans and South Vietnamese lost 6,000. Since the planners of the offensive expected a people's uprising, the most secret of the Communist cells had been ordered to emerge and lead the fight in the open. When the offensive was defeated, cell members had to flee to the jungle. Thus, the Tet Offensive ended in the destruction of much of the NLF infrastructure in the south. This was a heavy blow to the Communist war effort. After Tet, the regular North Vietnamese army did most of the fighting against the U.S. However, the Tet Offensive also brought about a different kind of turning point. It strongly influenced the opinion of the American public. For the first time in a major war, the power of television became apparent. 50 million people watched the destruction brought on by the war. The U.S. government was no longer able to portray the war in Southeast Asia as clean, simple, and easily won. President Lyndon Johnson and the U.S. generals had claimed the enemy was in decline long before Tet. But the moment Vietnamese commandos penetrated the American embassy in Saigon, all the official propaganda crumbled to dust. The war now seemed never-ending to middle-class America. The New Year offensive effectively ended Johnson's presidency. The senselessness of it was reflected in the notorious comment of a U.S. officer who explained the destruction of about one-third of the provincial capital of Ben Tre. It became necessary to destroy it in order to save it. Separate from conventional, unconventional operations of the 5th Special Forces Group were the clandestine operations of Military Assistance Command Vietnam Studies and Observations Group, MACV-SOG. The Studies and Observation Group was a cover name to disguise SOG's real function, and the name Special Operations Group, as it was sometimes called, described its real mission more accurately. The all-volunteer MACV-SOG activated in January of 1964. SOG was a joint services unit composed of members from all 4 branches of the armed forces, including Navy SEALs, Marine Recons, Air Force Special Operations pilots of the 90th Special Operations Wing, but predominantly Army Special Forces. They carried out some of the most dangerous and challenging special operations of the Vietnam War. MACV-SOG made high-altitude, low-opening parachute jumps behind enemy lines, routinely carried out reconnaissance missions along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, penetrated deep into Laos and Cambodia, recovered downed pilots, and attempted several POW rescues. Ranging deep in the enemy's rear, MACV-SOG reconnaissance teams forced Hanoi to divert 40,000 troops, about 4 divisions, to rear security missions along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. While some infantrymen in Vietnam despaired of ever seeing the enemy, MACV-SOG teams often found themselves fighting their way out of a hornet's nest of angry NVA battalions. With small reconnaissance teams numbering less than 10 men, MACV-SOG tied down thousands of NVA troops, provided invaluable intelligence information to the Pentagon, and destroyed large amounts of enemy material while inflicting grievous losses on the NVA.
We were basically going into their territory and saying, we can play this game too.
SOG was the brainchild of future CIA Director William Colby. As Hanoi stepped up infiltration of the South by the NVA, the U.S. countered with a series of covert attacks on the North. The unit organized to send a message to the communist leaders was the Studies and Operation Group, SOG. It was commanded by an Army colonel, but it did not answer to the Vietnam Command in Saigon. Its only masters were the Joint Chiefs in Washington. It was so secret that only 5 officers in Saigon were ever briefed on SOG.
Well, they had a pretty good system that they worked out with. They even had their own air assets that were attached to SOG, that were helicopter assets that would come in and take them out. And they did a good job. Many cases of extraction under fire.
Originally organized to train and lead friendly guerrilla forces behind enemy lines, Special Forces now had to train and reorganize for direct action missions as pure SF teams, or as leaders of indigenous volunteers and mercenaries into enemy-controlled areas beyond the borders of South Vietnam. Since the governments of Laos and Cambodia desperately attempted to remain neutral and prevent being destroyed by the same agony killing millions in Vietnam, they were too close to the flame to avoid getting burned. As a result, MACV SOG teams operated in secret against communist forces and shadow governments, thus enabling the U.S. administration's claim to be only advising local forces. They were supposedly only studying and observing while advising local forces in defense of their regions. It was a thinly veiled legal fiction that mirrored the changing of grid coordinates in document records to avoid admitting the reality of close air support and bombing missions across the borders.
In fact, SOG, when it starts out in 1964, well, 65 when it goes into Laos, in particular, it catches the enemy off guard, of course. The enemy is used to the Americans not coming into Laos, and suddenly these little teams show up, usually generally staying very quiet, and the rules of engagement again being not to be seen, not to fire on. And a fair amount of intelligence is brought back, but frankly, how much intelligence can a small team bring back in the greater scope of the Ho Chi Minh Trail? Not very much.
The members of SOG were the best of the best, but even these shadow warriors could not prevail against an enemy that was on high alert. Since they often operated deep inside enemy lines, stealth and light loads were necessary to fulfill their missions and to escape if compromised. While the CAR-15 submachine gun version of the M16 was a popular individual weapon, point men or whole teams often carried AK-47s to confuse enemy troops when they returned fire, and also allowed the use of captured ammunition if necessary. Individual uniforms and gear carried often was the choice of the team leader or the soldiers themselves.
We had C rations, which were canned rations that the military had. We had probably 3 days worth or 4 days we were carrying with you. I was the radio man, so I was carrying the PRC-25 radio, which was a FM radio, relatively short range, but we could easily reach the Covey fact that was flying around. And I'd carry a battery and ammunition, water, and a weapon.
Whatever they found that worked for them was what they were usually allowed to use in combat, in a clandestine war far from parade fields and sergeants major. Spit and polish had no place in the war in the shadows, deep inside enemy territory.
Black pajamas was what the Viet Cong normally wore. So if we were in an area which was the enemy's territory and they saw someone in black pajamas, they wouldn't think it was Americans. And therefore, if we saw them at the same time, we would have the advantage of knowing that anyone we saw, we were going to kill. And so it gave us a slight advantage. That was the main purpose of the black pajamas.
Locating an LZ to place a team was not as easy as it sounds.
The problem is there's only so many clearings in jungles of Laos. It got to the point where the North Vietnamese militia that guarded the trail, called Binh Troms, which were units, regimental-sized units, that were their whole job was to run the anti-aircraft, run the reaction forces, and keep their section of the Ho Chi Minh Trail. All along the trail is a different bin trom. They have this segment. That's all they did. One of their jobs got to be watching the clearings, going after the SOG guys.
The stated mission of the SOG was to execute an intensified program of harassment, diversion, political pressure, capture of prisoners, physical destruction, acquisition of intelligence, generation of propaganda, and diversion of resources against the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. Simply put, they patrolled, raided, and rescued downed crewmen. They led teams of QRF, or Quick Reaction Forces, comprised of small American teams or larger local forces under their leadership, to rescue Allied units in trouble in Laos and Cambodia. They were the Special Operations Fire Brigade, who could go where the regular military could not.
Well, in the early days, the point was to do your recon without making contact. If you made contact, you had bungled your mission. But towards the end, the idea was to take prisoners.
They were recruited, trained, equipped, and sent into the shadows to cover a lot of ground and create the maximum damage on short notice. Their operations are among the least known of the Vietnam War. That also means that a large portion of their losses are considered missing in action to this very day. Few that were captured or killed on operations were ever rescued or recovered. It was known by the operators that the missions were the most dangerous sort and that many would not return. The teams were usually a mixture of local native volunteers or refugee ethnic groups who often fought against their millennial foes and felt intense loyalty to their American teammates.
We were using 12-man teams. 3 Americans, which was the team leader, which was the 1-0. We had a assistant team leader, which was the 1-1, and the radio operator, which was the 1-2. They were the Americans. The rest of them were indigenous personnel. They could be Nongs, who are basically Chinese Vietnamese, or Montagnards, who were the mountain people. And the Montagnards were really the good ones to be with because they lived in the woods, they knew how to move through the woods, versus the Nongs, who were basically city folk.
One thing that SOG veterans say, I'm probably going on a limb here, but a lot of things that they say is that they had a huge impact on the North Vietnamese in Laos and Cambodia, in that they tied up regiments, whole regiments of North Vietnamese who had to remain behind to watch for these special forces. It's not true. They didn't tie anybody up. That was a job of the Bing Troms that were already there. It didn't matter whether special forces was there or not. They were going to be there doing their job. Main force units that were coming into South Vietnam never were tied up against SOG. If you were a Bing Trom in Laos, would you rather have a SOG team come to get you or the 101st Airborne? Yeah, I'd take the SOG team. Dangerous as they are, still pretty small. So in the greater scope of things, they did not they were good intelligence gatherers, did not tie troops up inside Laos.
We gave the military some intelligence that they never really would have had or known if we hadn't have been doing our mission, particularly in the early part, because there was a lot of doubt whether the North Vietnamese Army was involved or wasn't involved in the early part of the when I was there, and that issue was quickly solved when we had pictures of them marching down the Ho Chi Minh Trail.
By the mid-60s, SOG's days were numbered.
By 66, 67, like I say, the Vietnamese had gotten pretty good at knowing where they were. So most of the heroic stories you hear of SOG are heroic in the sense that they got found, they're running, and they're trying to get extracted. That's where most of the heroics occur. Well, what's the original mission of these guys? It's to stay quiet and undetected. So by the late period, by 67, certainly 68 and 69, the average time on the ground was very, very short. By late period, SOG was fighting a lot, and they were fighting because they'd been spotted and seen, and there's just no way around it. Like I say, you can't come in. There's only so many places you can land in a jungle. They could have walked over the border, but that would have taken weeks or months sometimes. So it's just too far. Not very good for the mission.
By 1971, SOG was disbanded officially, but during their secretive years, SOG had logged a combat record unequal in U.S. history. SOG's improvisations helped forge today's special ops doctrine for units such as Delta Force. It is no coincidence that U.S. Special Ops teams that probed deep behind the lines in Iraq were on blue light duty, the concept of which was developed by SOG.
A lot of lessons learned from Vietnam have been preached and taught in the curriculum at Fort Bragg. So in reality, I think a lot has been passed on because a lot of the guys that were in SOG ended up staying in, were sergeant majors and officers, and they have basically interwoven our experiences and lessons learned into the curriculum down at Fort Bragg. So I feel very good. And I think that the kids are much better prepared now, much smarter. Their equipment is far superior to what we had.
Perhaps the least understood and most effective counterinsurgency concept during the Vietnam War was the Phoenix program. While all other special operations missions were directed against communist military targets, Phoenix was specifically a means of neutralizing the Viet Cong political infrastructure inside South Vietnam. The idea was to cripple the communist shadow government that operated in the villages and countryside, drafting soldiers, collecting taxes, and undermining the South Vietnamese government. Using intelligence, informers, and a variety of other means, the political cadre and other hidden Viet Cong leaders would be persuaded to surrender, defect, be captured, or, if necessary, killed in a firefight with South Vietnamese or American paramilitary or special operators. It was likened to using a rifle shot rather than a shotgun blast approach to undermine the secret Viet Cong efforts to control the civilian population of Vietnam. Phoenix was one of several pacification and rural security programs that the CIA ran in South Vietnam during the 1960s. The premise of pacification was that if peasants could be persuaded that the government of South Vietnam and the United States were sincerely interested in protecting them from the Viet Cong and trained them to defend themselves, then large areas of the South Vietnamese countryside would be secured or won back from the enemy without direct engagement by the U.S. military. By 1967, the U.S. Military Assistance Command Vietnam, MACV, had succeeded in consolidating all military and civilian pacification efforts into one entity, called Civil Operations and Revolutionary Development Support, CORDS. The CIA and MACV were intensely involved in CORDS, which was run in conjunction with the Saigon government. CIA veteran Robert H. Comer initially headed CORDS, but it was most active and successful under William E. Colby, who replaced Comer in 1968. During World War II, Colby served with the Office of Strategic Services. After the war, he joined the newly created Central Intelligence Agency, or CIA. After Vietnam, Colby became Director of Central Intelligence. Colby served as DCI under Presidents Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford, and was replaced by future President George H.W. Bush. Colby believed the United States had to rid South Vietnam of the existing communist parallel government in the villages and eradicate the Viet Cong infrastructure, VCI, in the countryside. Thus, CORDS, while working on village defense and civic action programs, including land reform, infrastructure building, and economic development, also devoted considerable resources to rooting out the VCI. Another component of CORDS was the Phoenix program. Although Phoenix was run and ostensibly controlled by the Saigon government, the CIA funded and administered it. Phoenix built on the work of the CIA, creating a network of over 100 provincial and district intelligence operation committees in South Vietnam that collected and disseminated information on the VCI to field police and paramilitary units. Essentially, these committees compiled lists of known VCI operatives. Once the name, rank, and location of each individual VCI member became known, CIA paramilitary, or South Vietnamese police or military forces interrogated these individuals for further intelligence on the communist structure and its operations. The lists were sent to various Phoenix field forces, which included the Vietnamese National Police, U.S. Navy SEAL teams, and U.S. Army Special Operations groups, and provincial reconnaissance units such as the one in Tay Ninh. The number of Viet Cong cadres neutralized by various means by the Phoenix program between 1965 and 1972 are staggering, though wildly exaggerated by supporters and detractors. The CIA later estimated that between 1968 and 1972, Phoenix neutralized 81,740 people suspected of being Viet Cong cadre or NLF membership, of whom 26,369 were killed, thus crippling the communist infrastructure. While the Phoenix program did not destroy the Viet Cong infrastructure inside South Vietnam, it certainly prevented the communists from successfully operating a shadow government and overthrowing the Republic of South Vietnam through popular revolt. It's claimed that while the Tet Offensive of 1968 virtually destroyed the Viet Cong as a fighting force, the Phoenix program forced the communist cadres inside South Vietnam to go so far underground that it destroyed their effectiveness. The Viet Cong infrastructure and local military units were so weak that they had to be replaced by North Vietnamese cadres and military troops who were less effective than local native personnel. After the United States and other Allied troops withdrew, by 1973, it required the direct military intervention of the North Vietnamese Army to defeat an ill-trained, poorly equipped South Vietnamese military and government with poor leadership and morale.
Ranger! Port! Ho! Back! Ranger! Port! Ho! Back! Ho! Ho! 1, 2, 3, ho! Here we go! Here we go! Here we go! Here we go! Every day! Every day! Gotta run! Gotta run! Every day! Every day! Gotta run!
Ranger School at Fort Benning, Georgia is an intense 61-day combat leadership course oriented towards small unit tactics. It's been called the toughest combat course in the world and is the most physically and mentally demanding leadership school the U.S. Army has to offer.
We throw things at you rather fast. You've got to react immediately. Because later on, if you don't react immediately, you will be a casualty. And you're doing us no good. We have to put you in an old pine box because you didn't use your noodle. You'll be exposed to pain and punishment and other little devices that we'll think of for one reason and one reason only. To make you the type of person we need to get the job done, no matter what the job is.
For the Rangers who successfully completed all phases of the grueling course, there was but one destination.
Dear Dad, I'm writing this letter to you at your office because I want you to tell Mom in your own words. I don't think writing home would get anything straight. Well, here it is. We've been told that our whole company will be shipping to Vietnam. The only thing that makes me mad is how do they expect you to tell your parents? They act as though it's an everyday experience and that we should feel the same way. Robert Devon, 71st Infantry Detachment.
On March 7, 1969, the Department of the Army ended the independence of the LRPs with message number 89375. On that day, the LRPs became part of the 75th Infantry Regiment. As recognition of this special ops ability, the Army reinstituted the title Ranger. With the growing United States involvement in the Vietnam War, Rangers were again called to serve their country. The 75th Infantry was reorganized once more on January 1, 1969, as a parent regiment under the Combat Arms Regimental System. 15 separate Ranger companies were formed from this reorganization. 13 served proudly in Vietnam until inactivation on August 15, 1972. Ranger companies, consisting of highly motivated volunteers, served with distinction in Vietnam from the Mekong Delta to the demilitarized zone. Assigned to independent brigade, division, and field force units, they conducted long-range reconnaissance and exploitation operations into enemy-held and denied areas, providing valuable combat intelligence. The companies assumed the assets of the long-range patrol units, some of which had been in existence in Vietnam since 1967. They served until the withdrawal of American troops. Rather than create an entirely new unit designation for such an elite force, the Department of the Army looked to its rich and varied heritage and, on February 1, 1969, designated the 75th Infantry Regiment, the present successor to the famous 5307th Composite Unit, Merrill's Marauders, as the parent organization for a Department of the Army designated long-range patrol, LRP units, and the parenthetical designation Ranger in lieu of LRP for these units.
I got promoted to Staff Sergeant out of Ranger School. And I said, yeah, and they go, you want to go to 74th Infantry LRP? I said, hell yeah. I mean, who wouldn't want to? Anyway, being a Ranger, of course, that's what I wanted to do. So I wound up 74th Infantry LRP, and then, by the grace of God, I was there on 1 February of '69 when we actually reactivated as November Company 75th Rangers. And I just got to say that I was truly honored to serve with the great American heroes that I did. You know, there's a lot of hurt feelings. And after the Korean War Ranger companies were awarded the coveted Ranger, the school Ranger tab. And it didn't happen after Vietnam. There's a lot of hurt feelings. I see a lot of that stuff going around back and forth on emails from, you know, the email traffic I get from my old Ranger buddies there that served me in November Company Rangers, why they wouldn't award the school Ranger tab. Now, first of all, what I'm going to say, it's definitely not meant to be disrespectful to those that earned a coveted Ranger tab. And it's the finest light infantry school in the world, using patrolling, squad and platoon manuals, you know, as the training base. And Ranger School, of course, is designed to produce the finest light infantry trainers and leaders in the world, send them out to the rest of the units to teach Ranger techniques and detailed planning and rehearsals on how to conduct operations.
The redesignation in Vietnam had little impact beyond cosmetics. Units changed names and began calling themselves Rangers. The new Rangers were to wear the patch of their parent unit, since no official Ranger patch was authorized. In the finest tradition of the Rangers of the past, the Vietnam Rangers ignored what the brass in Washington wanted, and without exception adopted the black and red scroll of the World War II and Korean veterans. Along with the scroll, the LRPs adopted the unofficial motto of the Rangers. Rangers lead the way had been earned on the beaches of Normandy in World War II. The official motto of the 75th Infantry, Suis Ponte, also became a part of the LRPs. This motto was quite appropriate for the volunteer recon men, as it means of their own accord. What was the reason for the change? According to Lieutenant Colonel B.J. Sutton, who was the principal action officer for the change, in a letter to the company commander of Company H 75th Infantry Ranger, he said, "I do not want to see the Army, for one reason or the other, give them up in the post-Vietnam period." Operation Ivory Coast was the most audacious raid of the Vietnam War and an embarrassing failure. The mission was to save the lives of 61 tortured American POWs from a camp just outside Hanoi. This first joint services operation changed the way America conducted special operations forever. The Son Tay raid became the most misunderstood and secret combat operation of the Vietnam War. The concept of a rescue mission inside North Vietnam began on May 9, 1970. Through analysis of aerial photography, an Air Force intelligence unit concluded that a compound near Son Tay, suspected since late 1968 of being a prisoner of war camp, actually was. The liberation of troops and air crewmen captured anywhere in South Vietnam, Laos, or Cambodia became an immediate mission, with the goal of rescuing these prisoners before they were tortured, killed, or moved out of reach of those who could free them. Empty bamboo tiger cages had been discovered hundreds of times in temporary communist camps by teams rushing to find prisoners. While a few POWs did escape captivity on their own, no Allied prisoner of war had ever gotten free with the help of a raiding team. American forces on patrol often came across terribly mangled, tortured bodies of recently captured service members. The motivation for saving comrades from a fate worse than death drove many high-profile and desperate rescue missions. No one ever wanted to leave a fallen comrade behind. Hundreds of American Air Force and Navy aircraft were lost over enemy-held territory, and numerous images of poorly armed peasants marching newly shot-down aircrew into captivity were splashed all over international newspapers and TV news. Many of these men were wounded by anti-aircraft fire or rockets, and wounded or injured upon landing, or while being rounded up on the ground.
I could see the bullets ripping my parachute. I landed, I hooked a tree, but that didn't last long. I was finally on the ground with on my own feet when the mob, which was thundering down the street. It's like every little town in Illinois, every little town in the world. They've got a bunch of teenage or early 20s goons who are, they're going to defend the honor of the city.
The mob began to tear him apart.
And boy, they hit me like a pack of, like a quarterback sack. And then I had about a minute of being twisted and bent and kicked, but I wasn't really conscious of what was happening, except that I was being bashed heavily. And then a guy with a pith helmet, I saw his helmet later, he blew a whistle, and that ended that phase.
The battered Stockdale was thrown onto a truck to begin his journey to a POW camp.
I arrived in prison in a stretcher that had been put in the back of an old truck that I finally was put in to get up to Hanoi. It was Sunday morning. I looked out there and I saw that prison, and the driver of the truck went in to rouse somebody, and then the officer came out with him, and they saw me in the stretcher, and they were going to have some men haul me in. But I looked at the scene of a kind of a rainy Sunday morning in Hanoi, not knowing that I would never see that street for 7.5 years.
The idea that a camp containing POWs could be located inside North Vietnam and that an operation could be launched to rescue and return them seemed fantastic. But the miracle was almost pulled off just outside the North Vietnamese capital of Hanoi in 1970. Intelligence uncovered a small POW camp near Son Tay, outside of Hanoi. Army Brigadier General Donald Blackburn, Special Assistant for Counterinsurgency and Special Activities, SACSA, immediately met with General Earl G. Wheeler, the outgoing Joint Chiefs of Staff Chairman, to recommend a rescue of all the POWs at Son Tay. To study the feasibility of a raid, Wheeler authorized a 15-member planning group under the code name Polar Circle that convened on June 10th. The study group, after a review of all available intelligence, concluded that Son Tay contained 61 POWs. When Blackburn's recommendation that he lead the mission himself was turned down on July 13th, he asked Colonel Arthur D. Simons to command the Army's personnel. Eglin Air Force Base was selected as the joint training site for the prospective force. The base was well away from prying eyes, and training would only cease when Soviet space satellites passed overhead. Personnel selection proceeded over the objections of the Marine Corps, which was excluded from participation based on force needs.
In the early fall of 1970, actually August 1970, word came down that there was a special mission being performed. And, you know, I thought to myself, special mission, what's this going to be? Because these kinds of activities happen often. And someone told me that Colonel Arthur D. Simons, better known as the Bull in SF, was the head of this mission. So I knew this was going to be a good one.
Colonel Simons made a big impression on the young soldiers hoping to join his team.
So at the appointed time, reported over to the JFK, John Fitzgerald Kennedy auditorium, which Special Forces was kind of fond of President Kennedy. It was a small place, not real large, you know, but it was packed. There was easily 400 plus people in this auditorium, all because Colonel Simons was in charge. And I never forget, he came out on the stage the first time I saw the man. He was just an unforgettable character. You know, first off, he had a huge chest and a thin waist, and he had ribbons all the way to the top. Combat Infantryman's badge with a star, which meant he had served in two wars, not just Vietnam, but actually World War II and Vietnam. And he was a harsh-looking man. Some people would say mean. But he, no doubt in your mind, this man was a warrior.
The colonel laid it on the line as to what he required for this top-secret mission.
He came out on the stage and he looked out into the audience and he sort of growled and said, "There's too many people here." And then he said, "I got 3 things I can tell you." He says, "Number 1, there's no TDY money for this mission. That's extra money you get for going on special activities, temporary duty. Number 2, you will get shot at. And number 3, I don't know when or if you'll come back. My intent is to have you home by Christmas. Everyone take a 10-minute break. If you're still interested, come back." He cut the number of people easily in half, down to about 200 came back. And then he set up an interview schedule, and he interviewed every man nonstop until he finished all 200 of them.
Simons recruited 103 personnel from interviews of 500 volunteers, most Special Forces personnel of the 6th and 7th Special Forces groups, and Rangers from Fort Benning, Georgia.
Somehow I must have said the right thing, but I was selected along with 102 other guys. So a total of 103 guys. We all left Fort Bragg for parts unknown. No one told us where we were going, what we were going to do. We were just going to work for the Colonel Simons. We ended up at Eglin Field 3 in close to Fort Walton Beach, Florida, in a remote place. Field 3 is actually where Doolittle trained for his raid on Tokyo in World War II.
The planners and commanders knew that they had a very short time to plan, experiment, and train for this complicated and dangerous rescue mission. The raid target could be compromised by any number of ways, or the prisoners moved. There was always a sense of urgency combined with a quiet professionalism. Though few of the participants could guess the mission, they stuck with the tough training because they knew it was important.
We went into what we now call Phase 1 training, which was basically infantry tactics. You know, we did some patrolling. We shot everything we had. We had the M79 grenade launcher, 40 millimeter grenade launcher. We had the M60 machine gun, the M16 individual weapon, the 45 caliber pistol. We shot a lot of ammunition both day and night. And we blew up a lot of explosives and making different explosive packages for different missions, and threw a lot of grenades. It's just kind of fun stuff. At the end of that 2-week period someone decided we should do a field training exercise. And first thought, well, we'll just make it a survival field training exercise. So they broke us down into small teams. I was with 6 NCOs and myself, so we were a 7-man team.
Finally, the order came down to deploy, and the raiders flew back to Southeast Asia.
I thought we were going to go somewhere into South Vietnam, because any actions planned or rehearsed in South Vietnam, somehow the word always got out to the bad guys. So I thought they had trained us stateside and we were going to go into South Vietnam somewhere. Or maybe sneak back into Cambodia or Laos. We didn't know. We landed in, after some difficulty in airplanes, we landed in Thailand, was put into really tight isolation. And, we did the normal things, just check equipment, check weapons. Kind of get tired doing that after a while. We were sort of bored. And finally, on the second day, the doctor gave us all a sleeping pill. We took a little nap, and they woke us up. Went to evening chow, and I never will forget, went to evening chow in a mess hall, as dining facilities used to be called. The mess hall had steak. And I thought, oh my God, we're going to die. They're feeding us steak.
After the troops were fed, the colonel told his raiders what they had been training for and where they were going.
Turned out to be not a real great steak, by the way. After dinner, we went over to a briefing room, and that's when the bull stood up and gave us our final briefing. We had heard this briefing in parts many times, but he gave us the entire briefing. He started it out with a few simple words. He said, "Gentlemen, tonight we're going to rescue American prisoners of war in Son Tay, North Vietnam. Something that's long overdue, something they certainly deserve, and God willing, they will be free men tonight." And the room erupted. It just erupted, and we kind of looked. Did he say North Vietnam? Yeah, okay. To the man, they were ready to go.
We boarded the aircraft. Everybody checked each other out, making sure that they had their proper ammunition and so forth. And I was on the Greenleaf element. I was the first one off the aircraft, so I rode on the tailgate of the HH-53 going in.
Now, after months of training and guessing about their mission, the Special Forces raiders knew what they had been trained to do and were thrilled to take the war to the north to free the POWs.
And after the briefing, we went over and started loading up, checking our gear, put all the raiders and all the helicopter pilots and crews in a couple C-130s, and we flew to, I can't remember the name of the town, to a different part of Thailand.
Beginning at 2200, November 20th, 1970, aircraft began leaving 5 bases in Thailand and 1 in South Vietnam. The mission was on. The assault formation approached North Vietnam from the southwest, using the clutter returns of the mountains to mask them from radar detection, while U.S. Navy aircraft launched from the aircraft carriers USS Oriskany and USS Ranger in the largest carrier night operation of the Vietnam War. Starting at 0152, 20 A-7 Corsairs and A-6 Intruders, flying in pairs at stepped-up altitudes to deconflict their flight paths, entered North Vietnamese airspace on 3 tracks, dropping flares to simulate an attack. The last track also dropped chaff to mimic the mining of Haiphong Harbor. Over the Gulf of Tonkin, 24 other aircraft in 13 orbits provided support and protection. The operation prompted a frantic air defense reaction at 0217 that provided a highly effective diversion for the raiders and completely saturated the North Vietnamese air defense system. At 0218, Cherry 1 transmitted the execute command, Alpha, 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 to all aircraft as it overflew the prison and deployed 4 illumination flares. It then performed a hard-turning descent to 500 feet and dropped 2 battle simulators south and southeast of Son Tay. After Apple III made its strafing pass with the side-firing miniguns on the prison's guard towers, Cherry 1 successfully dropped 1 of 2 planned napalm ground markers as a point of reference for the A-1s, then departed the objective area to a holding point over Laos. The assault helicopters, in a single file, encountered winds that caused them to break formation 150 yards to the right of their intended track.
En route into the combat area, or the POW compound, I could see quite a bit what was going on out there. A reference to missiles coming up. It's sort of scary. You're sitting back there and you see something red coming through the air at you, but you know, we continued on. The helicopters, they would make evasive moves to keep from getting hit.
The pilots of Apple III, the gunship helicopter preceding the others, observed a compound nearly identical to the prison camp in size and layout, and steered toward it, followed by the assault lift force. This compound had previously been labeled a secondary school by intelligence sources. By that time, Blue Boy, as rehearsed, was firing its weapons to suppress any enemy in the target area from all openings in the helicopter. Bananas pilots recognized the air, applied power, and quickly veered north to the actual target. Despite the error and trees taller than expected, forcing a steeper descent than rehearsed, the assault team crash-landed into the courtyard of Son Tay prison at 02:19 with all weapons firing. Also at 02:19, Apple I dropped the Greenleaf support group south of that secondary school, thinking it to be the target prison compound. Unaware that they were 400 meters from their objective, it lifted off, heading for the holding area.
We flew into what we thought was a target area, but we had missed it by 400 meters, and we started towards what was labeled the secondary school. And as we come into this target area, the lead aircraft, which had the Greenleaf element on it, landed, and off they came. And my pilot broke radio silence and announced that we were at the wrong spot. And my aircraft and the Blue Boy element, which was the aircraft that was going to crash land inside the compound, broke away and flew north 400 meters and came into Son Tay, POW camp.
The secondary school was actually a barracks for NVA troops. Alerted by Bananas' aborted assault, they instantly opened fire on Greenleaf's two elements attacking the compound.
Next thing I noticed, the building that we were 90% sure was a barracks building for the guards, was burning, and there was an NVA standing in a window with flames coming out around him and going up to the roof, the thatch roof, and he's shooting at us. And around cracks between myself and my RTO, Terry Buckler, youngest man on the raid, by the way. He was 20, had just turned 20. Before I could react, Terry Buckler, who had never been in Vietnam, this was his first time, turned and put 30 rounds into that window, which eliminated that threat. And I thought to myself, I'm sure glad I picked this young non-combatant SF guy as my RTO, because he had just saved my life.
The support groups attacked the barracks with small arms and hand grenades in an 8-minute firefight. Simons estimated that 100 to 200 hostile soldiers had been killed.
It's still kind of confused. I'm in the wrong place, so now I've got to shift and get back to where my landing zone is and start my movement, my assault. And Colonel Elliot P. Sidnor, Bud Sidnor, good man, God rest his soul, grabbed me by my gear, and he's shaking me, and he's saying in a very cool, calm voice, Dan, playing green, Dan. Now imagine, if you will, there's a lot of chaos. People are shooting, a lot of yelling, a lot of things happening. The aircraft are leaving. 8-1 Sky Raiders are strafing the bridge on the north end of the compound. A lot of things going on, and this man is as cool as an ice cube. Dan, playing green, Dan. So we shifted our troops into a plan green, which was a plan, if Greenleaf is not there, then Red Wine would do certain things. In this case, we had all the targets of opportunity outside the POW compound. Our base duty, our initial mission, was everything east and south. And Greenleaf had everything east and north. And Blue Boy was inside.
2A1 supported Greenleaf with an airstrike on a wooden footbridge east of the barracks. Apple 1 returned at 0223, and by 0228, the support group had disengaged under fire and reboarded the helicopter for the short flight to the correct landing area. After a thorough search of the compound that included a second sweep, Blue Boy's 3 teams discovered that the prison held no POWs. The raiders transmitted the code phrase, negative items, to the command group.
I started pulling my men back out of that area, and they started moving in. And then Colonel Sidno calls me again and says, no items, which was our code word for no POWs. And I was flabbergasted. I was stunned. What do you mean? We're here. Everything's going as planned. No POWs. So I couldn't do anything with that message, so I put it back here in the back of my head right alongside the jump commands and went on trying to stay alive. Then he called me again and he said, Dan, I'm changing the extraction plan. 2 things wrong with that statement. First off, you don't use names on the radio unless something's very important. And so when the boss uses your first name on the radio, you know the next transmission is not going to be very good. I'm changing the extraction plan. In the middle of all this chaos, he's going to give me a new withdrawal order. He did, and so now I know I'm taking all of Red Wine out except for 3 people. I'm taking all of Blue Boy out except the 3-man headquarters on the 1st aircraft as opposed to the 2nd and 3rd aircraft.
On orders to withdraw, the HH-53s returned one at a time to the extraction landing zone through a heavy surface-to-air missile barrage, flying well below the minimum effective level of the missiles. Apple 1 landed first at 0237 and lifted off with its passengers, followed moments later by Apple 2. Apple 3, the last aircraft out, was cleared to leave its holding area at 0248. The raid had been executed in only 27 minutes, well within the planned 30-minute optimum time. Although at first it was feared one raider had been left behind, all the troopers were finally accounted for. One Red Wine trooper had been wounded in the leg, but he was the only casualty from hostile fire on the raid. The assault formation was out of North Vietnam by 0315 and landed back at UDORM at 0428, 5 hours after launch. For the hundreds of planners and raiders, the empty Son Tay POW compound was a disappointment. However, it was a profound shock to the North Vietnamese that the Americans were willing and able to go anywhere to free their captive warriors. All prisoners were rounded up by the communists from satellite camps and consolidated at the infamous Hanoi Hilton in the capital for safekeeping. Conditions and rations improved. The beating subsided. Now, with all the prisoners knowing who had survived, it became more difficult to just slaughter the captives, no matter how the war might end. Most importantly, confined prisoners learned the facts of the raid, and this gave them renewed hope for future freedom. In a way, the Son Tay raid contributed to the survival of more prisoners until their eventual release than those helicopters would have carried away from that single camp. The raid also proved that a complicated joint or multi-service operation was possible, utilizing the brightest and best operators and cutting-edge technology. The Special Forces had been used in Vietnam and around the world, mostly to train native troops as a force multiplier with occasional raids. The Son Tay raid was the first major direct action mission of the Special Forces and paved the way for the Delta teams and the United States Special Operations Command that deploys around the world at short notice to this day.